Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Canada-Caribbean Institute panel discussion on the subject of Canada-CARICOM relations in the Trump era. Just a bit of background on the Canada-Caribbean Institute before we dive in. It is a virtual collaboration of 12 universities in Canada and in the Caribbean, 6 on each side at the present time. The broad objectives of the Institute are to promote Canada-Caribbean relationships, to encourage collaboration, and to encourage institutions to connect with each other, scholars and researchers to connect with each other, and business and civil society to connect. We're also identifying challenges and opportunities in the bilateral relationship. My name is Robert Reddy. I'm the executive director of the Institute, and I'm really pleased to be here today with our panel for this session. We'll be posting a video of the panel on the Institute website, and I have to say we're very fortunate today that UETV will be broadcasting it as well. And to the UE, of course, a strong member institution of the Institute, thank you so much for putting more eyeballs on our discussion today. It's an important topic. There's no doubt the Trump administration has upended the way the US deals with its foreign partners, and in fact, the way foreign partners are required to respond to the United States. The Caribbean, as many will know, has seen a variety of threats and actions. Cuban doctors have come under the microscope, and the US has suggested that they should not be providing medical services in the region. There are, of course, threats of tariffs, threats of shipping fees, demands to stay away from Venezuela oil. A number of these kinds of things have arisen in the last 100 days. And of course, Canada has seen very high tariffs imposed on our automotive sectors, on our aluminum sector, steel sector. We've had ongoing threats of political annexation, and what some would describe as foreign interference in the election recently held in Canada from the president himself. So our governments on both sides are having to respond in their own ways to these developments, trying to understand them in the first instance and then devise strategies to deal with them. But an equally important question going forward is, what does this era, if we can call it that, mean for international cooperation between states other than the United States? What are the things that Canada and the Caribbean can or should do together in this new environment? One of the implications of the turmoil in international relations has been that it was difficult for a while to pin down some of the panelists, but I'm really pleased with the panel that we have today, and I really look forward to their contributions. We're joined by 4 people who can help us understand these issues. I have to say, if I gave them the introduction they deserve, I would use up too much time. Their CVs are on the Zoom platform that you came into the panel on, and you can find the CVs there. We're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have time for some questions. And you can forward any questions you do have via the Q&A feature of Zoom. So I want to briefly introduce our 4 panelists, and then I'll turn first to Professor Andy Knight. But by way of introduction, Andy Knight is a distinguished professor of international relations at the University of Alberta and a past chair in political science at that university. He's a former director of the Institute of International Relations at the UE and the former head of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean. He has written widely on the United Nations, on global governance, on children and war zones, and on global governance generally. Alicia Nicholls is a multilingual, multidisciplined, and legally trained international trade specialist. I know her because she has founded one of the Caribbean's leading blogs on international trade and investment, and that is a site that I frequent often. Alicia is a frequent contributor to international and regional publications and a presenter at many panels such as this. She's currently a fellow at the Shadath Roundfall Center of the UWI. Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith is a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. He has published widely on Caribbean national security, drugs, and crime issues. He has testified and consulted with US, European, and Canadian governments and military institutes, and he has held leadership positions at a number of universities in both Guyana and the United States. He has a new publication coming out very shortly, if it's not out already, on oil and climate change in Guyana, a publication that I really look forward to. And finally, Allan Culham. Allan is a former colleague of mine in Canada's Foreign Service, where he spent his career. He began with the Canadian International Development Agency in Botswana and worked at headquarters on various development files. In his time, he was Director of Energy and Nuclear Affairs for the department. He's had postings to Indonesia, Mexico. He was High Commissioner to Tanzania, Ambassador to Guatemala, and Ambassador to Venezuela. His last overseas assignment was as Ambassador to the Organization for American States. And following retirement, he's held a few short-term positions, including as Canada's Special Advisor on the Venezuela Task Force. So I think we have a really first-class panel. I'm looking forward to their contributions. And I think at this stage, Andy, I will turn it over to you to get us started. I know you have a presentation. Just give me a moment to pull it up, and then we can dive in. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be able to join with this very important webinar on Canada-Caribbean relations in the Trump era. Today, I would like to focus particularly on the critical global shift that has profound implications for all of us as a result of the Trump's second term in office, and look at particularly at the broader picture of the transformation of global governance amidst the disruptive force of the America First policy, which is, as you know, is a Trump policy going forward. First, let's try to understand what we mean by America First, because this is something that's being used as a slogan by Donald Trump. It encapsulates a fundamental reshaping of US foreign and domestic policy, one which prioritizes national interests over global commitments and over alliances. This is why it's important for us to have this discussion today in a broader sense. Though the phrase, I think, harks back to isolationist movements of the 1930s, Donald Trump has revived that phrase and rebranded it as a defining feature of his administration's worldview. And some of the key pillars of America First policy include, of course, trade protectionism, which I'm sure Alicia will be talking a lot about today, renegotiating trade deals and imposing tariffs seems to be a major part of this, this first pillar of American First, including tariffs on partners like Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, and China. A second pillar of this America First policy is really the militarization of alliances, putting pressure on alliances and reducing commitments unless direct U.S. benefits can be had from these alliances. The third would be the restrictive immigration policies that we see Trump has been imposing, the travel bans, the deportations, reduced refugee admissions, and tightened borders. The next one is withdrawal from international agreements, and we see this already happening with exiting from the Paris Agreement, but also the Iran nuclear deal and the funding of global institutions. And another pillar, I think, of the America First policy has been bilateralism over multilateralism, favoring direct transactional deals with individual states rather than using multilateral diplomacy, which has been the mainstay of American foreign policy since 1945 to the present. And then there's also economic nationalism, promoting Buy America, reshoring industries, getting industries to come back to the United States. And the final one, I think, would be the foreign aid reduction, cutting and conditioning aid unless it is aligned with strategic U.S. interests. And the big one, of course, is USAID, which has been reduced in its capacity to deliver foreign aid to countries around the globe. Now, what are the implications of America First policy for global governance? Well, the consequences, I think, have been far-reaching already. We see the beginning of the multilateralism being eroded. The post-1945 alliances are completely strained at the moment, from NATO to other alliances that have been created in large part by the United States in collaboration with Canada and the European countries. We've seen the US's soft power and global legitimacy being diminished as a result of America First policy. And we've seen a deterioration in relations between Canada and the United States significantly. And you note that Mark Carney, when he was elected as Prime Minister, or re-elected, I should say, as Prime Minister, his first statement was, when he won the federal election, was simply Canada's old relationship with the United States based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation. Those days are over, completely over. And of course, there's also the challenge of developing regions like the Caribbean countries that have been experiencing, as a result of Trump's policy now, a clear deprioritization in terms of US foreign policy. So in some ways, America First has therefore reshaped US global entanglements into a more nationalist, transnationalist, transactionalist, and unilateral form, ultimately signaling that the US is actually relinquishing its traditional global leadership role. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The next point is that we are living in a period of transition and global uncertainty. And this is just amplified now with the presence of Trump in the White House. We now find ourselves in what Antonio Gramsci has called an interregnum. And an interregnum, according to Gramsci, is a period of time in which the old order is dying and the new order has not yet been born. So there's an interregnum. A great variety of morbid symptoms appear during that period of time, everything from disequilibrium, feelings of disequilibrium, feelings of chaos, and so on, that we see on a day-to-day basis now with Trump's various announcements. Now, the pillars of the 1945 liberal international order are now under siege during this period of interregnum. The ideas, the institutions, and the material capabilities which form the pillars of any world order are now under attack. So things like democracy and human rights and free trade are being contested, things that we took for granted since 1945 to the present. Institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization and NATO, these institutions are being weakened as a result of the challenge coming from Donald Trump. Then, of course, the material capabilities, the US military and economic primacy now faces new challenges, primarily from China, but not only China. Other countries are also trying to fill that space that's being created as a result of the US's decline in its hegemonic position. America's post-World War II hegemonic leadership, characterized by multilateral institutions like the UN, the building of global public goods provisions, and so on, is now invisible decline and is being accelerated by Trump's America First doctrine. So in this what I call a post-hegemonic era, because I think it is a post-hegemonic era, there are some challenges and opportunities. I know we tend to focus a lot on the challenges because we are entering into a post-hegemonic era in which no state really seems willing to assume global leadership at this point. There's fragmentation and there's regionalism that are on the rise. More states want to be part of what I will call a new non-aligned movement. In other words, not being aligned to any major power. And there's a notable increase in the illiberal democracy that's spreading in various parts of the world. Even the United States is now becoming a illiberal democracy in many respects. And there's a return to this ultra-nationalism that seems to be accompanying in that kind of new ideology. And the norms and the rules become more contested and unstable during this period of time. Now, of course, this presents serious challenges to global political economy and to global political competition. And of course, there's also the problems that we face coming from things like climate change and health and migration. The cooperation around those problems are being weakened. Small and medium-sized states like those in the Caribbean may become even more vulnerable as a result of this weakening. So, but let's close on a more positive note. There is an opportunity here for Canada and the Caribbean. As the US pulls back, space is now opening up for new coalitions to be built. Canada is already signaling that it wants to have more collaboration with the Caribbean, for example, the Caribbean Canada Network that we talked about at the beginning, Robert talked about. But also there's a sense, a desire to remove ourselves from that dependency on the United States, uh, to be uniquely positioned to strengthen ties with other countries around the globe, to build regional partnerships, particularly global South-South relationships, and advocate for inclusive global governance. I think that's a positive part of this situation that we find ourselves in. So to close, my first, I guess, salvo would be, I would say, in conclusion, that America First reflects more than just the US policy shift. It marks a historical turning point, I think, in our global governance. While it has destabilized traditional structures, it also offers Canada and the Caribbean a chance to lead with fresh vision and purpose. And together, I think we can seize this moment to reshape our engagement and ensure that our voices help to define whatever the new global order looks like as it emerges. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. There'll be an opportunity for questions later, but as you were speaking, I was thinking that in some ways Canada and CARICOM in particular are in a really advantageous position if all states are having to find ways to make adjustments, because we have a recently concluded so-called strategic partnership, which calls for regularized engagement at the level of officials, at the ministerial level, and at the leaders level. Now, um, I think there have been one or two ministerial meetings possibly missed in the chaos of the last little while, but that framework exists. There's also, of course, the Caribbean Development Bank, which to which Canada is I think, the largest contributor, and there are the links between the English-speaking Caribbean and Canada through the executive director's offices at the World Bank and the IMF. So there are some really organic connections uh, uh, between Canada and CARICOM in this case that I think provide at least a platform for advancing on some of the things that you were talking about. But we'll come back to some of that if I can later. Um, I'd like to turn now to Alicia for your presentation. And I really thank you for being available today with us, Alicia. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here. Um, I want to thank you, Rob, for the kind invitation to participate in this important discussion. Let me first applaud you and your team at the Canada-CARICOM Institute for the great work that you're doing, including hosting dialogues such as this. So Professor Knight gave an excellent and comprehensive overview of not just the America First policy and all of its economic nationalist permutations and the wider political economy context, which serves as the background to this discussion. What I've been asked to focus on and reflect on is what does this new dynamic mean for CARICOM Canada trade? Specifically, what opportunities exist for deepening this relationship between the two of us, which extends all the way back to colonial times and continues into this present dispensation. And as Prof. Knight very eloquently noted, that we must seize this moment. So let me just reiterate that the US remains a critical partner for CARICOM, and nothing I'm saying is meant to suggest otherwise. But we all know that over-reliance on any single market increases exposure to geopolitical and economic shocks. And for CARICOM small island developing states, diversifying our trade and economic relationships are essential for reducing our small open economies' vulnerabilities to such shocks. So this diversification includes not just expanding South-South ties like what we're doing with Africa and China and Latin America, but also reinforcing ties with long-standing partners like Canada, which I would hasten to say is in a global storm of uncertainty. Canada right now is a stable and values-aligned safe harbor, if you will, aided by a sizable Caribbean diaspora in Canada, but also a Canadian diaspora here in the Caribbean. So just permit me to look back briefly in order to consider the present day. Those of us who are into political economy will know that that's always important. So Canada and the Caribbean share deep-rooted ties dating back to the colonial era when the British West Indies colonies traded sugar, rum, and molasses for Canadian fish, lumber, and flour in particular. And today those flows have evolved. Our trade is anchored in CARICOM, which is a non-reciprocal preferential trade arrangement in existence since 1986, and in which Canada grants unilateral access to its market of now 40 million people to goods of beneficiary countries or territories in the Commonwealth Caribbean. And for those of you who in the audience that might not be familiar with CARICOM, the beneficiary countries or territories are Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Bermuda, the BVI, the Cayman Islands, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, and Turks and Caicos Islands. And duty-free treatment is provided for all products except those of HS chapters 50 to 65 inclusive, so including things like textiles, and those products subject to most favored nation rates of duty, which are more than 35%. And this means that most CARICOM products are eligible for duty-free entry into the Canadian market once they meet the rules of origin. It's a non-reciprocal agreement, which means that the beneficiary countries are not required to extend duty-free treatment to Canadian goods entering their markets. And the reason for this was that it was supposed to enhance, or is supposed to enhance, as it was noted in the waiver that was made again back in 2023 for further extension of the WTO waiver, that it was meant to enhance Commonwealth Caribbean countries' existing trade and export earnings to promote economic development, new investment opportunities, and encourage enhanced economic integration and cooperation within the region. Now, there were negotiations which had started for a reciprocal agreement. These negotiations stalled after several rounds of negotiations, due, from what I understand, to differences in objectives for the agreement. So we see the structure for CARICOM Canada trade, but what's the level of trade right now? So when I looked at this on ITC's market access map, I saw that in 2024, bilateral trade between CARICOM and Canada was 1.2 billion US dollars. And that's quite small when you compare this to the region's trade with other partners, and no less Canada's trade with other partners. And indeed, CARICOM had a trade surplus with Canada until about 2019. And now Canada has a surplus with CARICOM in aggregate. And there are several reasons for this. The rates of utilization of the CARICOM preferences vary by country. So for some countries, the rate of utilization is quite high, in others it's quite low. From what I understand, I don't have the exact figures, but if anyone knows where I could find them, feel free to share. And indeed, CARICOM countries have gradually seen an erosion in market share in the Canadian market. So in preparation for this, I did a few calculations using some data from ITC Market Access Map. And they showed that in 2014, CARICOM's exports to Canada accounted for 0.17% of Canada's imports from the world. However, by 2024, it was down to just 0.09%. So we're talking about a very small share in the Canadian market and a declining share in the Canadian market. And this is not just limited to the CARICOM side. For Canada, Canada's exports to CARICOM in 2014 accounted for 2.5% of CARICOM's imports from the world. Fast forward to 2014, and it accounted for only 1.5% of CARICOM's imports from the world. So that, ladies and gentlemen, means that if you look at the trends, there is scope for expanding trade between us. Now let's look a little bit at what is traded between us. So gold accounted for a significant share of CARICOM's exports to Canada in 2024, followed by aluminum, acyclic, alcohols, rums and spirits, textiles, minerals and oils, vegetables, scrap metals, and seafoods. And Canada's main exports to the region were oil, wheat, iron ore, medicines, meat, fish, among others. And this is based on 4-digit level HS data that I gleaned from ITC Market Access Map. So this all means that there's scope for revitalizing this relationship, especially now that Canadians are looking for alternatives to US products, such as alcoholic beverages. So we could consider to what extent there's scope for greater rum exports to Canada. And being the curious person that I am, I decided to take a look at ITC's export potential map and saw that the Caribbean's unrealized trade with Canada was around 1.4 billion. So I need to do a bit more research on this, but a quick search in the database showed that the products with greatest export potential from the Caribbean to Canada are gold, aluminum, and methanol. But why I say I want to do more research on this is because we don't want to limit our trade to just commodities or low value products. We want to increase higher value exports from the region and ensure that our trade with Canada is not concentrated in low value products. So with that, I would say that rum is another area that we could consider as well with regard to goods trade. on the issue of services trade, travel and commercial services and transportation services were the main services traded. And I must also add educational services, given the linkages between our universities and the fact that many CARICOM nationals are studying at Canadian universities. And in tourism, data that I found from CTO noted that in 2024, Canada was CARICOM's second largest source market in 2024. I realized here I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap up very quickly. Which accounted for 3.3 million visitors, a 4% increase from 2023. And I thought this was important because given the fact that many Canadians, from what I gather, are seeking alternatives to certain like US destinations, like sun, sea, and sand destinations like Florida, for example, there could be scope for even greater Canadian travel to the region, and Canadian visitors tend to have longer stays, which is beneficial for our spend because it isn't just about getting the inflows in terms of people, but you also want the spend as well. CARICOM and Canada share common positions in multilateral fora on many issues, including their support for a rules-based multilateral trading system at a time which, as Professor Knight rightly said, multilateralism is under strain. So in terms of my concrete recommendations, and Rob would have indicated the Canada-CARICOM strategic partnership, which was launched in 2023, I would say that one of the things we need to do is to investigate the reasons for low utilization of the CARICOM preferences in order to make evidence-based interventions. So these sort of studies could be done in conjunction with UE. Yes, I'm putting in a plug for my university. So we need to understand if we need to launch additional technical assistance programs to help CARICOM exporters navigate CARICOM eligibility and rules of origin, etc. Strengthen SME export readiness and diaspora linkages. We need to modernize our investment treaties. Canada is a major investor in the region. One of the things I've noted is that the existing Canadian CARICOM country bits that exist are mainly older generation treaties which prioritize investor protection as opposed to investment promotion and really lack a lot of the developmental friendly provisions of newer bilateral investment treaties. And if it is that we want to ensure that investment between us redounds to the mutual benefit of both of us, I think we need to reconsider our bilateral investment treaties. I will also say promote partnerships in newer areas like fintech, creative industries, digital health and logistics, expand destination marketing campaigns, and explore multi-destination CARICOM packages for Canadian travelers. And to the extent possible, use the strategic partnership to coordinate positions in multilateral fora. So to conclude, in a world increasingly shaped by geopolitical unpredictability, uncertainty, deepening this relationship is even more important, but not in a reactive way, but seeking out new and shaping new opportunities that advance our mutual resilience and prosperity. Canada is already a valued partner with shared values, and there's much untapped potential for our economic relations. Let's deepen our CARICOM Canada economic partnership, not just as a buffer against uncertainty, but as a bold step towards the future that we want. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Much of it is reminds me of some of the things I was doing earlier in my career, and that's always interesting to reflect on. But I would just, before turning over to Ivelaw, I would just reflect that in much the same way as my comment to Andy earlier, it seems to me that Canada and CARICOM have currently, for their own purposes, a lot of the platforms that we would need to expand a trade and investment profile between us. We both have export development agencies. Canada has agencies devoted to facilitating developing country exports into Canada, and there are trade policy mechanisms. We just haven't decided between each other to use them and point them in the direction of each other. We're focused in Canada's case on, of course, our large markets like Asia and Europe. CARICOM, when I hear Prime Minister Motley speak, is focused on Africa, on South America, on Europe. Canada is in there at the end of her list, but I wonder if it's probably not a question of inventing new institutions or new mechanisms. It's just pointing them at each other and getting them to do some work. So that's just a reflection from me on the trade and investment side. But thank you once again, and Ivelaw, I would turn it over to you. And I understand you've got a presentation that you'll be running at your end.
Yes. Well, thank you, Robert. And let me begin by thanking you and the Institute for the invitation. And secondly, commend Andy and Alicia for the opening and second follow-up batting. Outstanding presentation, setting the context for the conversation we will certainly be having later on. Let me see if I can find my presentation. Can we all see it? Are we seeing the presentation?
What I see is your file directory at this stage. The presentation hasn't opened, at least on my screen.
Well, I'm seeing the presentation, Canada-Caribbean engagement, some known knowns and known unknowns. Is anyone else seeing that, or am I the only one seeing that?
I think you're the only one, Ivelaw. It may it was looking like it was going to open and then seemed to fail.
How about this? I'm seeing it again here.
Yeah, there it is.
What is the word about technology? It's wonderful when you can get it to work. How about that? Are you seeing the full screen?
Yes, and the title page, so it looks good.
Great, thank you very much. Well, let me again thank you, Robert, and commendations to Andy and Alicia for their presentation. What I thought I would do is talk about Canada-Caribbean engagement, invoking an interesting phraseology of a gentleman a couple of decades ago. And the gentleman to whom I refer is a former United States Secretary of Defense. Actually, turns out that he has the distinction of being the only person to hold that position twice under two different administrations, Donald Rumsfeld. And at a press briefing once during the Iraq invasion, he responded to a question with a very interesting formulation. He talked about, in dealing with policy, sometimes there are things that you know. He called that no-knowns. He talked about sometimes there are things that you don't know. He called that known unknowns. And he had an interesting combination of known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, and unknown knowns. But I want to focus just on two elements of the Rumsfeld formulation. I want to ask three questions invoking channeling Rumsfeld. My first question is the following. What are some known knowns about contextual factors that influence Caribbean-Canadian relations in the contemporary international order? And I thought it's important to begin with that global context. I'm sure many of us remember that powerful book written in 2005, published in 2005, by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. And that was a powerful reminder 2 decades ago of the globalization realities. And so, there was a Caribbean calypso way back that talked about different bones all connected. The world is flat, the world is connected. So I thought, let's begin by asking what are some known knowns about this global order? I want to proceed thereafter to ask the question, what are some known knowns about recent Canadian pledges and commitments to the Caribbean? Some of which were referred to by Alicia, some of which were mentioned by you, Rob, and mentioned en passant by Andy. And then I want us to have us end with a question about known unknowns about engagement between Canada and the Caribbean in the context of this new order, the new dynamics, the new set of circumstances, not only that the world is undergoing, but Canada is undergoing. So let's start with the first question. What are some known knowns about contextual factors that influence Canadian-Caribbean relations in the contemporary order? I referred to Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, but there's a plethora of literature talking about the way in which the international community is globally connected, that there's an interdependence across the global commons. And in that context, the nation is connected to the sub-region, the region is connected to the hemisphere is connected to the world. And sometimes the local global links, the local global nexus may not be appreciated in one part of the world, but you've got to appreciate if you're taking a broad view. You've got to appreciate that developments far away can affect a region that may not have even heard about them. You've got to appreciate that developments in one part of a region can affect things in other parts of the region or an entirely different region. Whether we know it or not, all of us in the Caribbean are impacted by the Ukraine-Russian war. I was reminding an audience only last week that one of the reasons why food prices in the Caribbean have increased since 2022 is because of the importance of Ukraine in the global commodity trade with regard to fertilizers, agricultural products generally. So you may not have heard about Ukraine before 2022, but Ukraine is an important part of the commodity trading of global agriculture products and things that make the agricultural sector work. And so it's no mystery where you've got price going up, whether in Jamaica or Guyana or in Caracas. And so there's the global local nexus part of the connectivity of the world. And I think it's important to remember that. And Andy did a wonderful job in talking about that nexus in the context of America First. But mentioning Andy's name, I want to go directly to Andy. And I want to commend to our readers and viewers to read an important article Andy wrote just 2 years ago, where he invoked Antonio Gramsci's Prison's Notebooks proposition about the interregnum. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. But I want to share in the context of that article, which I commend to everyone viewing this conversation, read a couple of sentences from that important article in the journal called International Journal. And what Andy said there is global politics in the early part of the 21st century has been dominated by gruesome acts of rampant terrorism, multilateral and unilateral reprisals, global economic downturns, hyper-globalization, deglobalization, mounting civil strife, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. You may not have heard about Gaza before October 7 last year, but the harsh reality is that the global commons is experiencing a genocide in practice, part of the interregnum context that Andy portrays, represents in that article. But I highlighted this particular sentence. The turbulent time reveals cracks, if not total breakdown, in the prevailing global order, and has led to even louder demands for establishment of new institutions across the global commons. Now, I also always remember in talking about terms of interest like interregnum, I'm reminded of something that French philosopher Voltaire reminded us all the time. We'd always say to the people with whom he spoke, define your terms, monsieur, let us define our terms. So if you want to ask the question, what is meant by interregnum? As Andy said in his presentation, an interregnum, a term that goes back to the late 16th century, coming from two Latin words, inter, which between, and regnum, rule. Interregnum refers to a period of discontinuity or a gap in a government, in an organization, in a social order. It is a time during which a throne is vacant between two successive regimes or reigns. So this interregnum has its definitional context provided by Andy in that article. And in his interrogation of the term, he recommends that there are three approaches that one may use. But he settles on, and I want to highlight the one that he settles on and recommends that we use in the context of our contemporary conversation. He talks about a sum of all diverse efforts of communities at every level to achieve specific goals while preserving coherence from one moment in time to the next. It is the last of these three definitions that seem most applicable in interregnum of the current order. So I think the interregnum context and concept is an important element of the known about the international realities that, whether we know it or not, are shaping the conduct of individual states in various parts of the world. But I want to end in recommending that part of the broader conversation has to allow us to zero in the context of global power on Canada and the Caribbean. Canada as a middle power, and the Caribbean as a region of subordinate states, small subordinate states. And I want to recommend that 2.5 decades ago, there was an important book that examined Canada as a middle power and Caribbean as a set of small states a book edited by two friends of mine, both of whom at the time were at the University of Miami. Tony Bryan has retired. Jerry Harr is now at Florida International University. And they asked me to write a chapter in that book. And my proposition in that book, in that chapter, is that if you were to ask the question, what is the correlation of forces? What is the relationship of this middle power Canada and these small states, Caribbean? I argued then, and I would argue still now, you've got the manifestation of power without paternalism. But big powers are not generally non-paternalistic. So the Canada-Caribbean relationship is a unique one where you've got a powerful state, a middle power called Canada, but you've got this constellation of small states, and there is not a sense of paternalism in the relationship. So the question may be asked again, remembering Voltaire, what do I mean by paternalism? Well, paternalism refers to a system, a principle, or a practice of managing or governing individuals or businesses or nations in an outwardly benevolent, often condescending way. My argument then, my argument now, is Canada's relationship to the Caribbean is not condescending. It's not a relationship of benevolence. It is a relationship of power without paternalism. And it might be an appropriate time for the Commonwealth of the Caribbean, Canada-Caribbean Institute, maybe to sponsor the preparation of a new study. What are the contemporary dynamics of Canada-Caribbean, picking up from that important book of 1999 that looked at a middle power in the global constellation, a very important player in the world level, and these subordinate states in the Caribbean, what are the contemporary dynamics of that going forward? So I think I want to recommend that those three are useful ways of capturing some of the known knowns at the global commons level. And so I argue in my chapter that for almost every Caribbean government, exchanges with Canada bring benefits without covert or overt design to diminish or undermine the position of the governments in question. And in terms of the international system, I said then, Canada is willingly invited to be a power broker, especially because its policies and pursuits are shorn of crass self-interests and tactics of intimidation. That was my recommendation then, my assessment then. It is my assessment now. Canada, as a middle power, operates with these subordinate states in the Caribbean without paternalism. So let's move quickly to the second question, since I only have like 5 or 10 Caribbean minutes left. Right, Rob? Which is about 8 or 9 regular minutes. Second question is this. What are some known about recent Canadian pledges and commitments to the Caribbean? We can spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I wanted to zero in on a couple of things pledged at the 48th CARICOM meeting in Barbados early this year, February. The gentleman whose picture is at the top right was then the Minister of International Development. Here are some of the things that he pledged at that Barbados summit of CARICOM. He used the opportunity to announce investments in projects across the region totaling $38 million. He pledged that Canada will support key initiatives to advance climate action, conserve biodiversity, promote sustainable and inclusive governance, and gender equality in named specific countries, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Haiti, and Suriname. He talked about an additional $2 million to top up an initial investment with regard to response for Hurricane Beryl. Known knowns, but Canadian commitments to the region. But there are more commitments announced at that same Barbados meeting in February of this year. The minister announced that Canada intended to use up to 10 million Canadian dollars for the technical assistance facility, the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund. Explain what that fund investment will help to do. But he ended his presentation by giving a kind of a summary of what has been some of the dynamics of Canada-Caribbean engagement since 2022. He said, Canada has contributed since 2022 more than $400 million to Haiti, including $86.2 million to the multinational security support mission that currently is floundering in regard to Haiti. So these, ladies and gentlemen, for me are some important known knowns about Canada's commitment to the region. So here comes a crucial final question. What are some known unknowns about Canada-Caribbean engagement? And this now is projecting not only the context of Canada's dynamics in the international system, given America First, given the Trump presidency, but Canada's changing dynamics within because of some of the things that Trump has begun to do and say. Even if you believe in the validity of the strategic partnership, the question has to be asked, will Canada be able to manage honoring all the partnership pledges? That, for me, presents some known unknowns. So I want to end my presentation in dealing with this question by suggesting that there are three critical known unknowns. We may come back to talk about them later on. Will the new global realities cause the new Canadian leadership to alter the nature of its engagement with the Caribbean? In other words, will the non-paternalism still color the engagement with the Caribbean? Or will Canada become paternalistic? Known, unknown. Here's my second question. Will the new Carney government feel able to honor the commitments made in February of this year? Are there pressures within Canada that may suggest that we've got to cut back on X, we've got to cut back on Y because of our own domestic circumstances? Known, unknown. And my final known unknown is this. How will Caribbean countries respond to any modifications in the approach or change in the commitments? That, for me, is a known unknown. It will depend upon what happens over time as Canada modifies its approach, modifies its behavior, revisits some of the commitments it's made. I suspect that some of the commitments will need to be revisited because Canada has begun to face some domestic pressures that will have financial implications. And so how Caribbean countries respond to any modification on the part of Canada, for me, a known unknown. Let me end, Rob, by sharing one couple of sentences, some of which connect to what Andy was talking about. I went back and I read the transcript of Mark Carney's speech when he became Prime Minister. And he said the following: our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over. The system of open global trade anchored by the United States, a system that Canada has relied on since the Second World War, a system, well, not perfect, has helped deliver prosperity for a country and for regions of this world. That system has changed. And so I want to end by suggesting that there may be conversation points about what Carney's recognition of the old order gone, but a new order in the making still all elements of that new order not being known, it's a good place for us to be comforted that there's some things which are in the offing that may not be all bad, not all negative, all reasons for despair. But overall, for me, there are so many known knowns and so many known unknowns. Let me stop there. I think I've used 10 minutes of my 15 Caribbean minutes, Robert.
Ivelaw, thank you. Thank you so much. I would, it's probably picked up in one of your known unknowns, or I sometimes get confused on those. But one of the things, just as a reflection, and it really comes out of my few years as the negotiator for the Canada-CARICOM trade agreement that, as Alicia mentioned, didn't end successfully. It's really sort of a question of bandwidth that I would worry about in the future, because Canada, for one, is going to be overwhelmingly preoccupied with its Canada-US relationship and trying to negotiate or somehow avoid some of the what seems to be coming at us. At the same time, and this was one of the dynamics in the trade negotiation. We have eyes on Europe and Asia as destinations for export diversification, and does Canada have enough bandwidth and attention to focus on the Caribbean in that context? And similarly, does the Caribbean, who is going to be looking to Africa, the global South, Europe, and dealing with their own issues with the Trump administration, have the bandwidth as an organization and as a region to engage the way we might hope they would with Canada? So those are probably subsumed in your points, but that's one of the things that I worry about going forward. But we can come back. I want to turn, before it gets too late, to my colleague Allan Culham. Allan, thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to your perspective as a former Canadian diplomat, and who has worked with a number of regions, but in particular the Caribbean in the context of the OAS and some of your other files. I'll turn it over to you. I just note that you're still on mute, so I'll flip it to you, and please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. Really, colleagues, I have to smile with Ivelaw's reference to The World is Flat. That book has been sitting on my shelf for quite a few years now, and I had not thought of it in recent times. But given the first 100 days of the Trump administration, I would now say that the world is flat. It used to be a known unknown that the world is flat. But now it's a known, because everything is upside down. So the world really is flat after all. So I just love that reference, Ivelaw. Again, my congratulations to the CCI for putting on this event. It's certainly an opportunity to meet some new colleagues, and especially in the world of academia, where I've had some contact in the past, but value this opportunity to deepen those contacts as well. Also, this is very timely, a discussion like this, because, as you know, we have a new government in Canada as of last week. Prime Minister Carney is due in Washington tomorrow. I hope they don't ambush him like they ambushed Zelensky. We have a G7 summit coming up in Alberta in June. Given Trump's performance at the last G7 that he attended in Charlevoix in Quebec, is he going to turn this into another carnival show and leave early like he did before? And then, of course, we have the Summit of the Americas coming up in December in in the Dominican Republic. So, you know, these are all important events and milestone events in the grand interregnum that we're in at the moment, but important events nonetheless. Before we talk about Canada-CARICOM relations, and I really hope to complement the comments made by my three predecessors, I think it's also important that we reflect a little more deeply on the nature of Trumpism, as I see it anyway, for what it's worth, because I think it's something. This phenomenon is something that we haven't seen before, and the impact of it is quite amazing. I think I'll go so far as to say that America, in my opinion, is now led by an autocrat who demonstrates absolutely no support for democratic values, open markets, or the rule of law. Everything is seen through a bilateral lens. Everything is black and white. Everything is a zero-sum game with winners and losers, not both. Everything is transactional. Let's make a deal. The White House, in its first 100 days, has shown its disdain for the European Union. It has severely weakened the credibility and integrity of NATO. On Ukraine, the US has changed sides and now blames Ukraine for causing the war, NATO expansionism for causing the war, and for the EU in trying to create neoliberal societies in Eastern Europe for the war. Trump has also launched a trade war with America's traditional friends, neighbors, and allies. Funnily, Russia was not part of the reciprocal tariffs, but most of his neighbors and traditional friends were part of that. All that to say is that there is a strong, strong belief now in the United States in the power of unilateralism, where it's important when you're playing a unilateral game to hold all the cards. And I think that is the mindset of the White House, and Trump in particular, in dealing with the international community. This is only the first 100 days. I shudder to think where we're going to be in another 100 days if the pace and pattern continues. I'll go so far as to say, and I'll reserve judgment on this after 100 days, that I think that the US is now emerging as the greatest threat to Western prosperity and security, quickly replacing Russia, China, Iran, and other lesser-known dictatorships and despots. But suffice to say, in looking at this new world, we have to recognize that the US is no longer playing a constructive, collaborative role, but is in fact playing a very tough game of unilateralism. My colleagues have referred to the decline of multilateralism and the fact that multilateralism is under strain. Absolutely, without question. This is a really bad time to believe in multilateralism. And I'll even go so far as to say to my Caribbean colleagues that this is a really bad time to be a small island state, because the future looks bleak for both in the current context of the world really is flat. On the geopolitical stage, things are changing rapidly. We can't say that we're surprised because Trump said a lot of these things during his campaign, but nonetheless, to see them actually being implemented and the manner in which they're being implemented has provided quite a shock to the system. So it truly is an understatement to say that these are complicated times, and that things are changing. Traditional alliances mean very little. NATO, the OECD, the United Nations, nothing is sacred anymore. And I think we have to realize that sad fact of life. And I think someone else referred to it, the years since the end of the Second World War, where we have built this international rules-based system and a system of multilateralism, how perfect or imperfect it is now being undone. And again, as Andy has mentioned, we're in this interregnum period to something which I think is very unpredictable. What is ironic about this, though, is that in our part of the world, is that as the US turns inward and becomes much more isolationist, with respect to Canada and Greenland and Panama, they've become expansionist. They have territorial ambitions in North America. And I don't think we should underestimate those territorial ambitions. This has been a consistent theme of Trump since that ill-fated visit of Prime Minister Trudeau to Mar-a-Lago shortly after the Trump's victory. He has called for the annexation of Canada. He's called for the takeover of the Panama Canal. And he's even threatened the use of military force to take over Greenland. With respect to the Caribbean and the US, I was very struck a couple of weeks ago, and I know many of our audience would not have participated, but the words of Ambassador Frank Mora of the United States, who is a former colleague of mine at the OAS, where he said in no uncertain terms that the Trump administration views the Caribbean as a threat. It's a threat for migration, a threat for drugs, and a threat for transnational crime. And these threats are to be addressed, not to be mitigated or looked at even in the broader context of things. So if there's any perception of that part of the world in Washington, it's that of a threat. Pretty harsh words, but he said it more than once as a reflection of that view. With respect to CARICOM and multilateralism and the OAS, I have to get something off my chest in that I think CARICOM has inadvertently weakened multilateralism in the hemisphere, in particular at the OAS. And I'm just going to throw out these three issues, but take it or leave it. CARICOM and ALBA's support for Venezuela since 1996 has substantially weakened the OAS and its ability to implement the democratic charter, which is one of the fundamental principles of the OAS. And the inability of the OAS to act in the face of rising dictatorships in the hemisphere is a severe weakening of the OAS and its mandate going forward. On China, I think the CARICOM has to some extent overplayed its China card in that there are very close relations between Caribbean countries and China. There are major infrastructure projects. There has been major investments in the Caribbean, but this was done for geostrategic reasons. Just as Russia has a very close relationship with Venezuela for geostrategic reasons to get at the US and to get at the Western Hemisphere, China plays the long game as well with respect to Taiwan and its search for natural resources. And to some extent, they have found a willing playground for this foreign policy in the Caribbean. Now, these two subjects could be perhaps seminars for another day. The last thing is on Haiti. I have to say this: the Haiti issue and has bedeviled the best minds and history in the hemisphere, and it really is something that I would really hope that we as a community and international community could finally come to terms with. And I know the CARICOM has been leading the dialogue on Haiti, and solutions are extremely difficult. The situation is very complicated historically, socioeconomically, etc. But a real re-push to deal with the Haiti the Haiti situation, I think is something that we really need to think about. Okay, I'll wrap it up. I have five suggestions. I was talking to Robert before, and we wanted to have a positive agenda for Canada and the CARICOM going forward. So, for what they're worth, here they are. But first, some rhetorical questions, and then I'll get to my David Letterman top 5. Will the U.S. be able to recover its balance? Will the U.S. be able to restore its foundational principles? Can we not just wait this out? Is this just an aberration the next 4 years? J.D. Vance is in the wings. I'm not so sure. And then, of course, we'll reflect again about the G7 summit coming up in the December Summit of the Americas and what kind of interaction there's going to be between the U.S. and its former friends and allies and its neighborhood. Okay, now some practical suggestions based on things I've heard today and the excellent report which I read on the CCI in preparation for this. Alicia has referred to economic cooperation. She clearly knows a lot more about this subject than the rest of us, so I think we should really defer to her. But there needs to be steps to rejuvenate the economic interaction between Canada and the Caribbean. And so over to her to come up with those specifics to make that happen. And she mentioned more than one. For those of you that have gray hair, some of you may remember in the very old days when Canada-CARICOM invested in building airports in the Caribbean in the 1970s and 1980s. And when I read about that geothermal project in Dominica and the experimental work which is going on in St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I thought, my goodness, what a wonderful program that we could collaborate on. The Caribbean Development Bank, Canada, the Caribbean itself. I think something like that is really very exciting, given that energy is a big focal point these days, and climate change and sustainable development and such. So I was really attracted by that Grenada project, and I think it's worth a tough look going forward and seeing if there's any way we could even make that a signature program going forward. Debt relief. Mia Utley talks about debt relief all the time, and it really, really has constrained sustainable development in the Caribbean, and it's constrained the sustainability of governance in the Caribbean. We're not talking about a lot of money here in the world scheme of things. So is there any way we can come up with a grand bargain to provide some much needed debt relief for that part of the world? So I just throw that out as a challenge. Regional politics. Caribbean now has a Secretary General of the OAS, Albert Ramdeen, who was Assistant Secretary General when I was there. Let's work together to reinvigorate the OAS, narrow its mandates, make it more efficient, support Mr. Ramdeen in his efforts to make multilateralism still relevant, because maybe what's going on in Washington will come to an end, and we'll see a renewal of multilateral institutions, and so we need to be ready for that. So my 5 were actually just 4, Robert. So I'll think of another 5th and send it to you by email. In conclusion, we have a new government here in Ottawa, and I really liked Andy's idea that Canada-Caribbean could be a focal point for the renewal of some kind of new international governance system. I really don't think just because of what's happening in Washington, we should really throw out all the hard work on the creation of neoliberal societies and democracy and human rights and inclusion. just because of what's going on down in Washington. These are still very, very valuable principles and ideas. And I think Canada could not look for a better partner than the Caribbean and vice versa in trying not only to preserve these values going forward, but maybe to enhance them for a time when they come back again. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity. And it's been a pleasure to be part of this panel. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks very much for your participation and those points. I mean, I have to say, I'd like getting those suggestions out on the table, and I'm sure there are many others in the minds of panelists and the audience. I mean, one of the big questions I think going forward from now, and I mean, I don't think our colleagues in global affairs and elsewhere inside the Canadian government are going to have a whole lot of time to go through this kind of exercise. But you know, we've got a certain profile of the development assistance that we're providing and have provided to the Caribbean. Um, is that is that what we should be doing in the future? I guess is the big question. You know, there was a question that came in on the Q&A about, you know, what are the prospects of Canada contributing more to the work of dealing with illegal firearms and trafficking and so on. I guess, you know, there's a whole support for democracy and sort of governance that could be prioritized, but it's going to be a huge lot of work for our colleagues inside the system. But I think there's a lot of contributions that we can all make from the Institute and from elsewhere. I guess I would really open it up for any of the panelists to sort of comment as we're trying to wrap it up on sort of the priorities going forward. Some of you focused a little bit more on that than others. I mean, what if Canada was to sort of have you know, a clean slate and you know, what should we be doing in the current context in the Caribbean? What are the priorities from your individual perspectives? I guess, Andy, you started us off. Maybe you could come in here if you have any ideas you could share at this point on that point.
Sure, I'd be happy to. One, talking about dusting books off the shelf that you have on the shelf sitting there for a long time, as Alan just mentioned, and also I think I've talked about Rumsfeld comments. There's one book that I just decided anyone who's followed me on Blue Sky would know that I be starting to promote this book that was written by David DeWitt and John Curtin way back when I was a grad student. In fact, I did such a critical review of that book that I hid from David DeWitt when I moved from Dalhousie to York University. I tried my best to avoid him because I didn't know what the backlash would be from my critical review. But the book was, I think those guys were ahead of their time when they talked about Canada as a principal power. And they went through in detail to talk about the foreign policy of Canada if it were a principal power. And they were making the point that we tend to be so focused on Canada as a middle power, this sort of moderating power, the middle power, that we seem to forget the fact that there are so many points of departure from that middle power mentality, including the value system. And the reason I mention this is because I think we may have to now, may be forced to now to move away completely from that middle power mentality and try to see how we can work with countries like the Caribbean countries, the European countries and so on, and have Canada take a leading role. Remember that during 1945, when the creation of the United Nations system, Canada was there playing a major significant role in having to form the United Nations system and the pillars of that, the institutional pillars of that world order. And it did so, of course, as it not still an emerging power kind of thing. Now that Canada, under Mark Carney, has made it quite clear that that world order is over, that we're moving to something else. This is a good opportunity, I think, for Canada to carve out a space for itself as a leading power, a principal power in that sense. And by principal power, I think David and Curtin were talking about was really related to complex neorealism, if you know anything about the theoretical aspects of international relations, moving away from sort of liberal internationalism, because that's under threat right now. But what if Canada could take a position that's closer to a neorealist position, um, and utilize its strength, uh, the strength of diversity, for example, that's considered to be poo-pooed upon by people like Donald Trump, but consider that this diversity is considered to be not just Canada's strength, but Canada's superpower. What if we were able to utilize that superpower of diversity, the numbers of people that are trying to get into Canada from the United States? I know colleagues of mine, two of my colleagues from Yale University are now at the University of Toronto, and they're talking about the democracy, developing democracies in a different way than the Americans have talked about democracy in the past. So there is a possibility that there's going to be a sort of a reverse brain drain, if you will, from the United States into Canada is already starting to happen. The attacks on the universities in the United States um, provides that opportunity for Canadian institutions to embrace those individuals that will not want to stomach being part of a fascist kind of regime and want to get out. We've seen it happen before during the Vietnam War. There are a lot of my colleagues at the University of Alberta that came up to Canada because they didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War. They basically left the United States and came to Canada, and now they're professors in the institutions in Canada. So that possibility exists as well. So I just lay this out in terms of the broader context of what's happening, that the Canadian government may want to, and I think us in Canada, and the Canada Caribbean initiative that's being formed, may want to sort of take a harder look now at what David DeWitt and John Curtin were talking about back then when they talk about Canada as principal power. Maybe there's something there.
Thank you, Andy. Just to, I want to make sure I'm reflecting some of the questions that have come in. One point that has come in reads as follows: one entry point to bring international partners to the table urgently is to look at the threats to public health, including climate health, crime, and the effects of social determinants of health. As in this case, it's a suggestion that this is something academia should take on, but I can imagine that there's some scope for government activity there as well. Alicia, do you have any reflections on sort of, as we wrap up, what priorities should be?
Thanks, Rob. So, given my training, I'm going to focus with the trade aspect. And I would say that because both Canada and CARICOM are facing challenges on the trade front, the Caribbean countries now face a additional 10% tariff on their goods entering into the US. And obviously, some exporters will bear the brunt of that, but many others are going to be looking for alternative markets. And what market better than one where you already have duty-free access to that market for most of your goods? So there's that, especially in areas such as rum, etc. But I'm also thinking about in terms of services and investment. So looking at newer areas like renewable energy, fintech, creative industries, medicinal and health tourism, pharmaceuticals. I see Dr. Kenneth Connell, one of my UE colleagues, is here. And then, of course, I think that we need to focus on the Caribbean diaspora in Canada, but also the Canadian diaspora in the Caribbean. I think when we talk about diasporas, we always mainly focus on the Caribbean diaspora in Canada. But I think the Canadian diaspora here in the region is also an important, I wouldn't say tool. That sounds a bit too that doesn't sound aesthetically pleasing, but I would say that we could leverage them as well in terms of deepening this relationship. And as we know, there are diaspora associations and communities, both for the Canadian diaspora here in the region and of the Caribbean diaspora in Canada. So I would just wrap up to say that thank you so much for this forum. This forum has been extremely enriching, and I'm definitely looking forward to any additional outputs that might come from this work. Congratulations to you at CCI and to my colleagues. I really enjoyed all of your presentations and look forward to any future engagements on this. Thank you.
Aspired to be a member of the Canadian diaspora in the Caribbean, but I haven't quite made it yet. Ivelaw,
Not too late.
Ivelaw,
Not too late. Not
any
too late,
last
Robert.
words for you?
I wanna offer a brief comment on Alan's question about priorities. But before doing so, give me a minute to say something about one of the points made by Andy and one of the points made by Alan himself. Andy gave us a very nice mapping of some of the pillars of the America First. But I want to recommend, Andy, that there are 3 missing pillars. I think we've got to include it as a pillar, something you mentioned en passant, the attack on American institutions, the attack on the press, the attack on universities, the attack on private sector businesses that do not conform. The big fight with Amazon last week over an allegation that they'll be doing its business in a different way. I think that attack on institutions is a core pillar of the America First. A second important pillar, I think, that Andy might want to reflect on is the beginning of restrictions of liberties and rights by American citizens. It's not only doing what it's not only limiting what immigrants may do or see, but to say that you have no compunction with sending American citizens to El Salvador, and to restrict the rights of people in dramatic ways as a clear authoritarian indications are there. But here's my final recommendation, Andy, and you mentioned it in one context. There's a de-emphasis on diversity, on equity and inclusion. Could you imagine mandating the Department of Defense to remove Colin Powell from its website? Could you imagine a pursuit where, because a plane had gay in its name, that plane is now expunged? There is a dangerous de-emphasis on diversity, on equity and inclusion, which I think ought to be part of any complex representation of the pillars. But I want to say something about something mentioned by Alan. Alan, the territorial ambitions, for me, have significant, broader than American implications. They're likely to end up giving permission to others who have got territorial ambitions. Maduro will say, okay, I don't have to bother with the ICJ. If the ICJ says to me, Guyana owns that territory, I'll just go take it. China will say, I don't care what the Americans say, Taiwan belongs to me, I'm just going to go take it. I think we're likely to see a number of geopolitical dominoes around the world where people can say, well, if America can legitimize grabbing people, grabbing places, taking possession, why shouldn't we? I think that's a dangerous dynamic. I hope it doesn't come to pass, but the implications of it are there. Let me recommend, insofar as priorities, it would be in Canada's interest to have a short, discrete list of priorities. It will be in Caribbean's interest not to recommend a long list of priorities. The resources will not be there to do more than a couple of things. So in that context, I want to recommend focus on three things. Focus on governance, with Haiti being the primary indication of where the emphasis should be. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to Jamaica to present a paper on Haiti. And I'm going to be representing some things in that paper that are not going to be happy to some people in the Caribbean, because I think, as I'll say there, Haiti is a manifestation of what the sovereignty limitations of CARICOM are manifest. CARICOM as a collective. So I think if Canada can do anything with regard to governance in the Caribbean, Haiti should be the one critical element in that governance list. Climate financing, not necessarily to give Caribbean countries the financing, but to enable the multilateral and private sector resources that can be mobilized to help Caribbean countries with climate financing. And I would say the third item that I would recommend being on that list is food security. Yes, you've got Guyana, which is now being asked to revise the 20%, 25 by 25 to be 30 by 30. And yes, Guyana has 83,000 square miles, but this food security challenge in the Caribbean is not going to go away, even if Guyana were to step up significantly. So I would say governance, a la Haiti, climate financing, and food security, I would recommend on the priorities list for Canada.
Thanks very much for that. Allan, you kind of got me started on sort of the list. Do you have any final words on sort of summing up that conversation?
Ivelaw reminded me of what was fifth on my list, and I have it here. I'm not parroting him. I said,
I'll send you an invoice, Allan. I'll send you an invoice.
I said to try not to embolden autocrats. And I had specific reference to Venezuela and Guyana. Having lived in Venezuela for 4 years, where every Venezuelan believes that Guyana is theirs, this is not going to be an easy nut to crack. Yep. And the OAS can be useful, and we don't want a world where autocrats are emboldened to take rash action along the lines that Ivelaw says. My final comment, being an old school, old line diplomat, relationships, that's what matters. And in this age of artificial intelligence, Zoom, social media, what have you, maybe the world really is flat after all. But it really comes down to developing those kind of relationships that endure and that create cooperation between countries, communities, societies at all levels. And I just refer to, again, the G7 summit coming up next week, the Summit of the Americas, where in events of their own, they're probably not important, but what goes on behind the scenes in developing those relationships that could lead to some new emerging international order along the lines that Andy has stated. Who knows what could happen, but here we are. So again, thank you very much.
Robert, permit me to add a footnote to something that Allan just said about relationships. I think I have it in a book I published in 1993, a story that was told to me by a Barbadian diplomat of the relationship between Errol Barrow and Pierre Trudeau that led to that airport being built in Bridgetown. Relationship.
Well, listen, I want to thank you all for participating in this panel. I found it really interesting and enriching. I would apologize to a couple of the people out there in terms of questions. We're not going to be able to have the time to answer them, but we'll no doubt be holding similar events in the future, and perhaps we can get to some of those questions and some of the great points that have been made today in this panel at a future event. But so at that, I would just like to draw this to a close and to thank you all for participating. This will be posted on the CCI website shortly, and I look forward to future collaboration. Thank you all very much, and thanks the audience. The registration audience and also the UE TV audience. Appreciate you being with us. So,
Thank you,
so
everyone.
long, everyone.
Thank you.